This is Barry, and welcome to the Simplicity Zen podcast. If you're new to the podcast and you're watching on YouTube, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed to the channel and clicked on the little bell, which gives you alerts, and then liked the video itself. And the reason I ask is, it gives me a small dose of serotonin when I see people doing that. But more importantly, YouTube uses those metrics in determining whether it distributes the video to other people. So it helps a lot. If you're watching or if you're listening on one of the myriad of the podcast networks, such as Apple or so forth, you can subscribe through that app, or you could go to the website at simplicityzen.com and sign up for the mailing list. Today, my guest is Satya Vayu. He's a Zen monk originally ordained by Kobun Chino Roshi. He has practiced at Tassajara and No Abode monasteries in California, and he has extensive practice experience at various Asian monasteries, including Bukkoku-ji in Japan, where he trained with the legendary Harada Tangen Roshi. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Harada Tangen.
Yeah. Did that basically all sound correct?
Sure.
Yeah, I got, so the reason
lots of interpretations you can make.
Yeah, so I the way I was connected to Satya was Kokyo, who's the Suzuki Roshi priest I've interviewed before. When I asked who else he'd recommend I interviewed, he recommended Satya. I guess they have a long friendship and practice history together. And so a lot of that's information I pieced together from Kokyo. Kind of get started. Can you talk a little bit about your current situation? You have a practice community there in Oregon, correct? A small sangha.
Yeah, we have a few people living here in a house, and we have a daily practice schedule here. Mm-hmm. We start not Zen style early, but about 6:30 in the morning. And we practice to 11 in silence, 2 periods of sitting, and quite a bit. I'm very interested in physical practices as an adjunct to meditation. And meditation itself can be seen as a physical practice, but we do some qigong and also have a lot of time for yoga, and we do some chanting as well. And then silent. We actually just recently have reinstated a oryoki style, maybe a little abridged oryoki style meal at about 11, and then after that we have a lot of free time so people can do their own thing. So it's kind of like half a in-city Zen theme house, but a little bit more than that usually is, with a little bit of a monastic schedule every day.
And so the people who live there, it sounds like they're not going off and working that much. They're kind of following the schedule through the day. Is that correct?
Right, that's right. Sometimes they do part-time jobs in the afternoon when they can fit, but there's no charge here, and nothing's ever has a charge. Any program that I've been involved with, I feel pretty strongly about trying not to get money into the spiritual realm as much as possible, and so they don't have to work. We also work with a group called, well, they don't have to work for money. We work with a group called Food Not Bombs, and collect a lot of food that otherwise might go to waste from various, mostly farmers markets, but also bakeries and tofu places and such.
And where are you located in Oregon?
We're in Portland.
Oh, Portland. Cool.
And we also have a Sunday group. That's kind of our biggest thing. So the Sunday group might have anywhere from 7, 8 people to 12 people coming. And that's in a public park right nearby. So
okay.
One of the hallmarks of our Sangha, and as I've been practicing for many years, is sitting outside, even in the winter. A little difficult for some folks, but we really enjoy it. So we found a nice secluded part of this park. And
is this rain or shine? Do you guys?
Yeah, pretty much. If it's raining heavily and steadily, then we'll sit in the house instead. But it's rarely like that in Portland. It's kind of on and off. So usually at the time to choose where to sit, it's not raining, and then we get out there, start sitting, and it starts raining on us. So that's but we try to keep it as dry as possible.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up in New York City.
Okay, like in what are the boroughs?
Right in Manhattan, yeah, Upper West Side.
Yeah.
But my early life, I was, well, continuing to today, I've been very drawn to be in more natural surroundings. So at that time in Manhattan, I was quite starved for nature, and
Uh-huh.
going out to the woods on the occasions that we did was the most profound and meaningful experiences in my early life. I think that's a lot where my spiritual inclination came from, spending time
How far
in
were
nature.
you from the Central Park?
Oh, we were very close to Central Park, luckily, so that helped me survive. We were just a
Yeah.
block,
That can
so
get
I
a little
spent.
naturey, right?
What's that?
That can get a little, I mean, you can get kind of isolated in there a little bit. It's pretty big, it seems.
In Central Park? You can, I suppose, if you really make an effort. If you go to there were some parts of the park that in those days were not such good neighborhoods. My parents didn't let me go to, but they're more woodsy, and that's probably where you'd go for solitude. But
Uh-huh.
in the winter, you can find some solitude. But I'll tell you, in the summer, on nice days, it's like elbow to elbow in Central Park because everyone's trying to get some green
Uh-huh.
away from the trees.
And I'm curious, what did your parents do for work in New York?
My father was an architect. When he worked, he had a big span in my growing up where he wasn't working and was having somewhat of a hard time. But in my early life, he worked designing hospitals,
Hmm.
and my mother was a second grade teacher.
Hmm. So it sounds like a pretty solid middle class American upbringing.
Usually,
Were they like politically liberal, conservative,
uh,
religious, not religious?
liberal. I mean, from my political standpoint now, it's all uh, a different scale. But
Right.
yeah, regular Democrat voting, pretty
Hmm.
liberal on most things, intellectual, really into art. I grew up going modern dance a lot. They really loved that, and classical
Hmm.
music. My father was very into, and particularly both of them. And yeah, so the artistic background was wonderful. And my father actually had quite a, not compared to the lifestyle I've developed, but pretty deeply questioning of material values.
Hmm.
So we had, much less of the kind of fun frills than a lot of my friends. We had a small black and white TV up until I left home for college, which is
Hmm.
already, late 80s.
Hmm.
So, um, yeah, never had the video games, never had the cable TV.
Hmm.
And I appreciate it now. My father was always we'd have to turn the sound off during the commercials so we wouldn't get brainwashed into buying more things. And
Hmm.
so that definitely planted a seed. I think when he saw how far I took it at some point, he was a little upset, but at first. But I think
Was he was he kind of a child of the '60s at all? Do you think
they
that
were a little
influenced?
older than that. So I'm sure there were a lot of it that they appreciated, but they weren't, partying hippies.
Hmm.
Um, they weren't sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So,
Hmm.
um, uh, but yeah, I have some early memories. It wasn't the '60s anymore, but I had some early memories of some kind of hippie-like gatherings from the extended family that we went to that I have very positive feelings about. So that might have
Hmm.
influenced as well.
Yeah. Did you have was there any sort of spiritual or religious context to your childhood at all? Did you guys go to church, or were there books laying around the house? That
No,
type of
we're
thing.
we're ethnically Jewish.
Uh-huh.
That was important as an ethnic identity to my parents, but completely non-observant and completely non-religious. My
Hmm.
father was a kind of how would you describe him? Like Bertrand Russell, humanist,
Hmm.
uh, atheist, proponent, very science oriented, although art too. He liked the balance of science and art, but I think science was kind of his, you know, maybe worldview for
Hmm.
what reality is composed of came from there. Um, so yeah, no religious upbringing, which now I'm appreciative of as giving me a little more of a blank slate, perhaps, than some people. Although people come to interesting things by all sorts of routes, so it doesn't matter. But I had a religious phase around the age of 12. I think 11 or 12. I was maybe first really was understanding that I myself was going to die.
Hmm.
Not too far off, really, in the scheme of things. And
Hmm.
so that was that was quite dark, and I started praying every night to God as
Mm-hmm.
my own escape from dealing with the dread. And I used, kind of Jewish language because that's all I had exposure to. And
Mm-hmm.
I had a bar mitzvah myself, even though my father never had.
Hmm.
And I had never gone to Hebrew school or anything, so I had to get tutored by a local rabbi who did it for free. It was very nice, and it was an Orthodox synagogue too, which is really
Mm-hmm.
pushing things for my parents. But it was the local one, and I kind of appreciated doing things a more
Right.
traditional way if I'm going to do them at all, right? So also, the school I went to had lots of friends who were having bar mitzvahs. There were a lot of Jews in the school, so part of it was probably just social conformity, to be honest. But I did have, I was definitely searching at that time and praying, and um, I didn't find a way forward really with that religion, but it was maybe the first step for me.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if my
Um,
rabbi was the Kabbalah or something, I would have gone down a different route, but I don't know.
so where, with kind of your existential kind um, of angst, like, were you kind of a serious teenager, or were you able to kind of have fun, normal teenager things, or?
Not normal. I hope I was able to have some fun. I remember some fun, but I
Yeah.
wouldn't say normal teenage things. No, I was pretty serious and pretty much a loner. I think
Mm-hmm.
I had a number of friends in elementary school and maybe middle school. It started to change in middle school. My values started to change, and um, I became pretty focused on being an environmentalist pretty early on and taking the problems of society, which I saw as really deeply embedded in a wrong direction of civilization. That was pretty strong for me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I think fairly solitary. I mean, I had some friends, but
Mm-hmm. Do
I
you
didn't take drugs. I didn't date anyone.
You said did
Part of
not
that
drugs? Is that what you said?
was that
No drugs? Is that what you said?
no drugs, no sex. I didn't have anything against sex. It just wasn't happening for me.
Yeah.
So pretty solitary, I think. But
Mm-hmm.
I met some good friends, some that were influential. Um, I met a guy a year younger than me when I was about 15, 16, who was vegetarian already. And when I heard that, I immediately became vegetarian the next day. I just hadn't encountered that could actually be a reality, although I'm sure I knew of the concept. Um, so yeah, I started that pretty early on. At that point, I was very into being a writer. That was kind of my focus. I'd been interested in creative writing since quite early on. Um, and also, I was a long distance runner since fourth grade, which,
Mm-hmm.
when I reflect on it, I kind of think that was kind of some kind of meditation for me, a time to really,
Do you think you
uh,
like dropped into samadhi when you're running?
yeah, I kind of, yeah, I mean, samadhi means so many things to so many people, but definitely you're in somewhat a different place, and you're also learning about endurance, not just physical endurance, but how to be okay with being physically uncomfortable in some ways for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
and what it feels like to push yourself beyond the concern, beyond when your mind is just swimming around with mundane concerns. So I think there's a lot of parallel with meditation practice. And when I did actually start sitting practice regularly, it's just about the same time I stopped running. So might be might be related.
Did um did you do any martial arts or anything like that as a kid or a teenager?
Not so seriously. I did. I guess when I was like 11 or 12, I did taekwondo for maybe 1 or 2 years. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think largely because I was small and my brother would beat on me sometimes, so I wanted some defenses. Um, but I think there was maybe there was something beautiful about the tradition and stuff that maybe had some resonances with what I got into later. In
Mm-hmm.
college, in college, I started sitting toward the end of college, but before that, I did take some Tai Chi, and
Mm-hmm.
I didn't then for many years, but then many years later, I took it again, and now it's a part of my practice.
So where did you go to school?
I went to high school,
No, college, sorry.
college. I went to Oberlin College. You heard of that?
Where is that?
It's in Ohio, of all
Oh,
places. It's a small liberal arts college, kind of, elite and somewhat hard to get into, and not the hardest, but um, so it's a lot of people from New York and California, not many people from Ohio there.
Mm-hmm.
But one nice thing about it is they have a famous music conservatory. I wasn't in the conservatory, but it was part of the college, and so there was wonderful music there. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm friends with a lot of people that were serious about that. Music's always been an important part of my life. So,
Mm-hmm.
um,
And did you study writing there? And you said you wanted to be a writer.
yeah, that was my initial. I mean, I kind of had this idea about getting a very general liberal arts education, so I was trying to take everything across the board. But my focus, I was an English major, and they have a separate creative writing department there, or they did then. I don't know what's going on now. And so I got into that. That was selective, and so at the beginning, that was really my focus. But as college wore on, something about having to write on demand when you weren't necessarily inspired, and then having your less inspired pieces being deeply critiqued by a small group was a little deadening for me of my inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
And also, all my writing was kind of about spiritual things and spiritual transformation, usually in nature. And so when I finally encountered an actual practice, that kind of took over, and my inspiration for writing died down. My last couple of years, I was taking a lot of Asian religion actually, so I probably would have had a minor if I had declared it.
Mm-hmm.
But
What did you? I'm sorry. What did you say? What you ended up graduating in?
well, I kept the English major,
Oh,
but
okay.
my last years I was really focused on taking religion.
I see.
Originally, I knew I was interested in obviously my writing was about spiritual practice, but I thought studying religion academically was kind of a waste of time.
Mm-hmm.
But when I didn't get into some class that I wanted to get into, and I had extra space, and so I took this Indian religion class, and then I thought, oh no, this is actually really fun because I'm learning about the ways people have expressed it through history and different cultures, the same deep spiritual yearning, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. So then I took Chinese religion and more Indian religion and
Mm-hmm.
Japanese religion and some.
And did that really
Just
resonate with you?
did that the
The,
classes?
the Eastern religion, Eastern traditions?
Yeah, I mean, pretty immediately I knew this was my home, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
My first experience with that, I think my second year of college, I was actually during a summer, and I had Joseph Campbell
Mm-hmm.
he did this TV series with Bill Moyers called The Power of Myth. I
Mm-hmm.
actually watched that with my father when I was still in New York, when I was still in high school. But I had a deep appreciation for that as my first introduction to religious stories being metaphors for something deeper, so that you didn't have to take the religious stories as literal dogma, which
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't have withstood.
Mm-hmm.
But so that was inspiring to me. And one summer I was working in a bookstore in Winooski, Vermont, which is right next to Burlington. And someone came in and bought The Power of Myth, that book that they made about it. And I was like, oh, that's such a good book. I saw the series. And then he also bought a Krishnamurti book. And
Mm-hmm.
we had a small bookstore, so we didn't really have a spiritual section. We had a New Age section that had everything in it. And I was very cynical about New Age stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I just thought Murphy was another New Age guy. And he said, oh, no, he's not. He's really interesting. You should check it out. And so I did. And that was very influential to me. So I had some early preliminary experiences reading Krishnamurti. And in college, then we had an experimental college where students could teach things and townspeople could teach things. And so I taught a class on, well, I really facilitated a discussion group on Krishnamurti. And
Interesting.
I included for Zen Mind Beginner's Mind was in there as on the reading list. So
Hmm.
I was definitely into that by that point.
So you'd read it previously, or is it just you're like, oh, this looks like something that might be nice?
I think maybe I read it right then, just before the class. Yeah. But I had taken Chinese and Japanese religion, which covered Zen already. So I had a little background. But
How
really,
did
I
you
think
tell?
I wrote a story in eighth grade that was about uh, it was based on my cousin. The assignment was to write something on one of J.D. Salinger's 9 stories. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but
Mhm.
the last story in it is called Teddy, and it's about a young genius boy who's like 9, and I won't ruin the punch ending, but um, it kind of comes out during the story that he's a reincarnated high guru from India or something. And I
Mhm.
resonated with that story. And then I wrote a story, and it was about my cousin who had developmental disabilities or differences, and he never really learned to speak very well. But I wrote a story about one day he learning to speak, but I made it in a sense that his worldview was collapsed and reduced in breadth and depth because of putting things into language. So I was definitely interested in that quite early on.
Yeah. How did you do the transition from kind of reading about spirituality to practicing? Like, how did you start sitting?
Well, there was a group starting my first year of college, a sitting group, and I immediately went because I knew I was interested. And it was led by this guy who really didn't want people thinking it was too special and religious and highfalutin. He wanted it to really be like, easy access and uh, grassrootsy. So we met in a bar, I remember. I wasn't old enough to drink yet, but we met in a bar. And it was starting, but then something in this guy's schedule, he just lived in the town, I think. Something in his schedule changed and he couldn't do it. So I went through the next couple of years and I knew that as soon as I started sitting, I was going to sit for the rest of my life every day. And so I kind of put it off because I wanted to have a little more normal college experience, which I didn't really anyway. But so I put it off. And then my last year in school, he started the group again. And then I went and then I did sit. I had quite a feeling from the very first sitting. And so I did start sitting.
What was his tradition?
So he had learned, he didn't call himself a teacher or anything. He was a very humble, really, really wonderful guy. And he had learned from a guy named Tim McCarthy in fairly near Kent, Ohio. And so eventually we went to see Tim, who had like a day-long sitting in his house. He had like a Zen themed house. I think he was in grad school at Kent at that time, but he had gone to Oberlin actually, so he knew Oberlin people pretty well. And he was a student of Kobun Chino, who later became my teacher.
Right. Yeah, you probably know Brad Warner, right?
Yeah, I know Brad.
Yeah, that's where he got started with Zen as well.
Exactly. Yeah, I once saw him here in Portland at a someone made a movie about him, I guess, and he was at the showing at this little local theater we have. And I went and talked to him and I told him that. He was like, "Well, I've never met anyone that studied with Tim before." So really
I'm curious. I've always wondered, does Tim McCarthy, did he have Dharma transmission, do you know, or is he kind of just like an informal teacher?
I don't believe he did. Both Coben and most of Coben's students have deep questioning about that whole institution. I mean, I don't want to speak for Coben, and no one can now because he's passed quite a few years ago. But he definitely did things that undermined it sometimes. He would suddenly give people brown robes, but not the rest of transmission. And he did a lot of things that kind of played with it. So I don't, like all traditions, it has a service. It can be used well. And also it can be misused. And if it's taken too seriously in the sense of black and white, then it can be misleading, I think. So I think a lot of his students weren't too wrapped up in that.
Yeah. Well, and the reason I asked is because like Brad in his writings would refer to him as my Zen teacher, and I was always curious was, what I'm just curious was he actually a priest or was he just a layman who was empowered to teach Zazen? It's kind of a digression. I was just kind of curious about that since
Yeah, I think he just was who he was.
Yeah.
And I think as a teacher was really pushing that. He didn't want to make it so much about whether someone has sanction or not. He didn't make it very clear whether anyone had sanction. He didn't make it clear whether he had sanction, Dharma transmission, I hope most people know in Japan, and it's pretty much true, I think, in Korea and China as well, didn't really mean much, and it still might not mean much, but it might mean more now because we've invested it more. But when it first came over, people thought, oh, to get transmission means you're enlightened, but in Japan, especially in the Soto school, it just means you're a full priest and everyone gets it if they keep with it in the training for a couple of years. Sometimes it can just be 1 or 2 years. So it doesn't mean much. In the Rinzai school, it means a little more. You have to go through koan training, but even that, depending on the teacher, might not mean much. So it might mean a lot for a particular teacher and a particular student. We don't know, but as an institution, as an abstract idea, you can't know, right? So that's kind of my feeling about it. Yeah, I didn't know if he had sanction. I didn't even know what that meant. I just was told he's been practicing for a long time. He's has some experience, and I met him and I liked him, and he had
Mhm,
some good things to say. Not that he became a teacher for me. I only spent a couple of days with him probably. Um,
mhm,
but he had an impact because he said, if you're really focused on Zen practice after college, just go to California where most of it's happening. More so at that time. I think the East Coast is a good competitor these days, but he knew a lot of folks out there because he had spent some years out there. And he said, I think Coben is, the most special teacher I ever met. So I hope you get to meet him and you decide. And I had that in my mind when I finally
mhm,
graduated. And that is what I did. So
mhm. Did during college did you have any experience with psychedelics or anything?
I did, yes.
Mhm,
Not a lot. I say I did so quickly. It wasn't a big thing in my life, but I think it was influential. I think it was important. Um, I remember I hadn't done anything at all. I hadn't even gotten drunk before college. Well, maybe once when I was 14, just drinking it so quickly that I just threw up and didn't really experience being drunk.
mhm,
But by the time I was in college, I was like, oh shit, I should see what being altered is about. And I remember the first 5 or 6 times smoking pot and nothing happened. And then I was
mhm,
like, all right, I have to go farther than this. And I took some mushrooms and then something happened. So, but I remember clearly that it didn't feel something very new. It felt like a confirmation of the path
mhm,
I was on, the direction I was in. And I also felt what it was showing was not something uh, contained by the drug, not something that's just about the drug. The drug
mhm,
was reducing some habits so that I could see something that was really true all the time.
mhm,
Um, so that I didn't, after I maybe did it 5 or 6 times, and then I felt like I have to stop doing this because if it's really the truth, I just have to start living that way and not relying on something to help me taste it.
mhm. Yeah.
So, but it was very confirming for sure.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And do you think you would have gotten into meditation anyway without the psilocybin or psychedelics, or do you think it was
So,
kind
I mean, with the stories I had written and my interest in some kind of amorphous, but kind of Asian-based spiritual transformation that I was already in, and my experience with nature, I
of?
mean, those were really my most profound experiences from childhood, and I really think that had a lot to do with getting to a place where the usual stories of human agenda and narrative were non-existent, and realizing there's something so much more profound about existence itself than the stories we're telling ourselves and each other, and the goals that we're running after. So that was pretty clear for me from a young age. I didn't have a practice to apply to it or a philosophy necessarily, but I think that would have led me there anyway. But it could only have happened this way anyway. So
Mhm.
use that
So
speculation.
when you graduated, did you pretty much go directly out to California to Coben's?
I
Coben's
did.
uh,
VW, my brother's VW bus. I don't know how to drive still today, but we
mhm,
went out. My brother took me out and to as far as Boulder, and then I had to hitchhike and
mhm.
hiked to Taos, where Coben had one of his places. That's where I was kind of told he was last heard of. So I didn't know about Coben's
Oh, so you didn't
reputation.
even reach out to him first. You just
No,
went out
no,
there.
yeah.
Nice.
But uh,
Yeah.
but that's when I first started to learn about Coben's mysterious wanderings and unreliability in his physical presence. So he was nowhere to be found there. But a couple of Sangha members took me under their wing and were very kind. And one in particular named Stan White, um, who had been kind of the priest making sure zazen would happen every day in the little zendo there. It's just a garage of a house that was converted into a zendo. It's quite beautiful. It's outside. It's adobe like a lot of stuff
Is
in
this before Jacob? Could Jacob? What is the monastery called? Jacob? Could
Jikoji.
Yeah, right, right, yeah,
Jikoji is his temple in the Santa Cruz Mountains in
right.
California. That was the not his first place. He had had several places, and his first
Okay,
place was over Suzuki Roshi's. I think it was called Haiku Zendo already down in Los Altos or wherever that was. But the first place his sangha kind of bought as their own place that they were really developing, I guess, was Jikoji, and that
okay.
was in Santa Cruz Mountains in the 70s.
Was that before or after you showed up?
That was
Like,
long
that
before.
already exist?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Tim had been there, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
But so much later, he ended up in Taos, New Mexico for some reason, and he started a place there called Bukkoku-ji, and
Hmm.
that's where I first visited. And
That's where you first what? I'm sorry.
that's where I first went, yeah, on that trip.
Okay.
But
Oh.
Coben wasn't there, so after a little while, I left. You know, I was told maybe he'll be in California, so maybe you should go there. And I was kind of headed there anyway.
Mhm.
So after a couple backpack excursions, uh, incredible hitchhike experiences um, in the Red Rock Desert there in Utah, I eventually landed in the Bay Area and lived with some college friends I was in a band with in college for about a year. That was my 1 year of living more or less normal for a
Mhm.
recent postgraduate. I had a job, and I went every day to the Berkeley Zen Center because I was in the East Bay. So
Okay.
I started with Mel Weitzman. I did my first
Hmm.
session there,
Hmm.
and but after 1 year, that was it. I retired at age 21. So I was like, enough of this money thing. And Mel suggested it would be good for me to go to Tassajara. I remember the discussion with him. I said, I'm very concerned about the state of the earth. I feel like we're at a crucial crux. This is 30 years ago. But
You were right.
yeah, he said, well, just go to Tassajara for a year. And when you come out, there'll still be environmental problems to work on. It should still be okay. Give it a year. So I said, okay. But he knew I would be hooked on the monastic thing, I think. So that
Mhm.
was that.
So they let you
But
go to
during,
Tassajara without previous practice period experience or
yeah,
whatever?
yeah. I guess it wasn't as strict then, but he gave me special permission. I guess I had done a session with him, and I had already at that time worked out to meet Coben. So I'd gone down to Jikoji for some sessions as well,
Hmm.
and I think the first one was led by Angie Boisevin, one of his senior students. But
Hmm.
eventually he showed up, probably late, probably in the middle of the session sometime, and I was quite impressed with him in a mysterious way. And so I liked him a lot. But I also liked Mel. I could relate to Mel more easily because he was American and more similar to my background. Um, so I had both of them for a little while. And Mel suggested I go to Tassajara. Coben thought that was a good idea too. So I went to Tassajara. That's where I met Kokyo. We became very good friends back then. He was not Kokyo yet,
Hmm.
and he had dreadlocks and big beard.
Hmm.
And I probably did too. I don't exactly remember I shaved my head the first time at Berkeley Zen Center, though I remember, just to check it out. So
Hmm.
I don't know what my hair situation was,
Yeah.
but yeah.
What was so you said you were taken by Kobun Chino when you first met him. Could you describe what he was like and what it was about him that kind of piqued your interest?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
um, he I mean, what you learn, I think what most people are impressed by him more was his demeanor, how he carried himself, you know,
Hmm.
the just how present he was in the moment of moving and walking and
Hmm.
looking at, and placing incense in the incenser. And his places, he never really taught. He was very maybe shy. I don't know if that's the word, but not really liking the role of an authority teacher kind of person.
Hmm.
And he also really didn't like Westerners or Americans trying to imitate being some kind of thing they thought was a proper Zen student, specifically not a Japanese Zen student. He
Hmm.
really didn't want people to have that. He had grown up in a very traditional background, and although a lot of that, I think he had a deep appreciation for the beauty of it, because he continued expressing himself in a lot of traditional Japanese ways. But he also, I don't think he liked the stultifying forcing of fitting into a box that happens in Japanese culture at all. And he definitely didn't want to replicate that in America. So as
Hmm.
a result, he was very reluctant to teach anything specific about form. I mean, he did, especially in his early years. I mean, Suzuki Roshi caught him over here specifically to teach form at Tassajara from Eiheiji because he was fresh
Hmm.
out of Eiheiji, several years at Eiheiji. And he was very good at it and he knew it very well. Um, and he loved it. I mean, it was a beautiful art form for him, but he didn't want to push these things on people. So when he had his own place where he was in charge of, he kind of let people draw it out of him and he didn't push it. As a result, a lot of things were a little, compared to Tassajara, things the rituals and ceremonies were a little rough. And what was so beautiful was he would come into this, more rough-looking zendo that at that time was really not fixed up. It was pretty. The whole place had been built by hippies, like hippie high school students in the '60s, as an alternative high school, and so it was all rickety and it was a cool looking. I liked it, but it was rickety. But he would come into this kind of environment, but just like be so intent on beautifully doing each thing, as this performance, a kind of performance art, And that was just beautiful to see. And that he didn't say the same Zen thing that you always hear. And he didn't push you. And you didn't know where he was coming from. And when he finally did give a talk, you'd ask questions and his answers were just like reciting poetry that you didn't even exactly know what the hell it was had to do with the questions sometimes. I mean, sometimes it was more straightforward. I don't want to make it seem it was always like that. But I just thought that was great, I was like, I wanted someone who I didn't understand to work up to, So
would he wear his like koromo and case stuff like that?
Yeah. But he didn't require other people to, at all. So.
Yeah.
And actually, once I was I did this session that was a little bit not session, this ango at Tassajara that Reb Anderson was leading, and it was a kind of controversial one. I don't know if people still talk about it, but it was quite exciting at the time, where some people were complaining about being forced by the tenkin. This is someone who, I don't know what the original job in Japan is, but someone who became like the Zen cop, that if you didn't come to Zendo, they'd come to your door and knock on your door. Do you get to Zendo? So some people complained about that. So Reb was like, but this is all what you chose to sign up for. This is just to help you. And if that's not clear enough, let's make it clear. Everything is optional. And so that was very controversial. And some people stopped coming to things. Most people still went to things, but I liked sitting. I loved sitting, and I loved the ceremonies. And so I went to everything, but I wasn't so into the robes. And so I stopped wearing my robe, which was kind of required at the time. And I remember going on a run with Reb once, and he said, yeah, I don't even know why people started wearing robes. He says, I like my priest that I ordained to wear robes, but other people, there's no reason for them to wear robes. So he was okay with it. But eventually some other student came to my door and expressed how upset they were that I wasn't wearing a robe. So I put a robe back on. But Coben, part of that was the influence of Coben, I think. He just wanted you to find your own way, your own expression, He wore it because that's where he came from. That was his cultural background, and
Was he a temple son, do you know?
Say again?
Was he a temple son? Did he grow up with a Soto father?
Exactly. But a little different because his father died when he was 7.
Okay.
So his elder brother took over the temple, and he was adopted by another priest who didn't have children somewhere else in the town. And he was given transmission by this other priest, after he hated. So he had a little different, somehow, the death of his father at a young age had really impacted him, I think.
So he was a legit practitioner, not just a ritual.
Right. And also when he was about 16 or 17, I think it was, I'm just guessing now, but there's some biographies online. He met Sawaki Roshi, Kodo Sawaki Roshi.
Oh, okay.
This was the person who was really the biggest influence in his life. He calls his Zazen master. The person who gave him transmission, he says, oh, he was my chanting master because he was really into chanting. But I think Sawaki Roshi was the biggest influence on him about practice. And he would go and visit with Sawaki Roshi. And then he studied with Sawaki Roshi academically in Kamazawa University. He was in the same class as Deshimaru Roshi, I think, and probably some other people who later became well known.
The one quote of Kobun Chino Roshi that comes to mind is I think someone asked him, I'm probably butchering this, but I think someone asked him something like, what's the most difficult thing about teaching Westerners Zen? He's like, oh, after they have their first Kensho experience, it's impossible to work with them or something like that.
He didn't. He made a lot of jokes, and sometimes you never knew when he was joking or when he was serious. But he didn't usually talk about Kensho so much. Sometimes he just flat out said, I've never had an awakening experience. But, you learn, I hope most people learn when they've been around the block, that what an awakening experience is very subjective and very different for many different people. And of course, if you're serious about practice and practice for years, you're going to have some experiences, somewhat unusual experiences. But how to compare them with other people, who knows? So he said different things at different times about that, but he definitely didn't influence it.
I thought he had some Kensho experience where he saw the snow from outside the Zendo, or I thought there was some story like that or something. I might be misremembering.
So that's how much he didn't emphasize it.
Yeah. So you went to Tassajara. Had you visited prior to going to Ango there?
Prior to what? I'm sorry?
Before going to the practice period there, had you visited it? Did you know what you're getting into at all?
No. I just dived in. I was I was full on. I was like, Mel, I don't want to do a practice period at Green Gulch. I'm not serious enough. I want to go to Tassajara. He's like, okay. And
was Mel the was he abbot of San Francisco Zen Center at that point?
Yeah, he was one. It was Mel and Reb. Yeah.
So he had authority to be like, yeah, you can just go.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it was as unusual then. I'm not sure if it was strictly that you had to do a practice period elsewhere. I don't really remember, but it was probably a little different. But I did have to go for a summer first to earn credit,
Oh, you did?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I had to go for the summer season, and then you get credit for the rest of the practice periods for the rest of the year. Mm-hmm. So yeah, then I dove in, and after those 2 practice periods, I was like, nah, not serious enough.
So when you went to Tesla, did they have you do Tongario? Yeah, I have to say, I've done a lot of sesshin over the years, but Tongario for me was at a different level. That's the hardest thing I've ever done.
Oh yeah.
I mean, of anything ever, I think.
There's only 5
this was at Sonoma Mountain Zen Center. I don't know how they do it at Tassajara, but
hey, that's I visited there before. I guess I had been to Berkeley already, but before I went to Tassajara, I visited. No, actually, it was earlier. I think I was still in college, and I came out on a trip to California. I can't keep it all straight. Sorry.
Do you remember what year?
Mountain. It might have been the very first Zen Center, and I met Jikusho Kwang Roshi and really appreciated him. Do
you remember what year it was by chance?
I don't. I mean, it's going to be around 1990.
Yeah. I didn't go there until mid-90s. But anyway, you're just sequestered in a room. You could go to your room to sleep at night, but in other words, you're just in that room the entire day unless you're going to the bathroom. And there's no kinhin or anything. I mean, that was, I think in a lot of ways that was kind of my pivotal.
Some people go to the bathroom a lot, as I remember that.
Yeah.
Actually, I remember Suzuki Roshi said, I think in a talk, of course I didn't see it, but reading, I think he said that's how he survived Tongario at Heiji. He had to go to the bathroom a lot, which really helped him. I don't remember it being really hard for me. I was really into sitting, and my body was already pretty flexible. So I was probably sitting in full lotus already, maybe not for the whole Tongario, but probably a lot. So, and I was just gung-ho, so I was okay. Yeah. But it was exciting. I was really excited to be immersed in this. But after a couple months, I was like, no, it's not strict enough.
What do you think was lacking in terms of strictness?
I didn't like the discussions, the amount of discussion. And the second pack with
you mean like talking about a sutra or something like that, the study groups?
Partly the study session, but I'm interested in that, so I don't want to say that I wasn't. I could be quite an intellectual, I had studied in school, but maybe because I had a facility for that, it wasn't interesting to me. I was like, that's not relieving suffering. So I wanted something more strictly focused on practice, and although I enjoyed reading that stuff, I felt it was too dilute, but maybe more the discussions just amongst people, just everyone talking about their idea. They think practice is like this, and we think practice is like this. And I just wanted, a clearly deeply awakened teacher to give whatever instructions necessary, and then the rest of us just do it, And I did find that later because I went to Japan for most of my training, so that's what I didn't like so much. I was going to say that second practice period that became kind of experimental. Although now when I look back on it, I think that was great. It must have been really interesting for people. But at the time, it led to a lot of discussions. Reb stopped teaching for a while because he got offended by someone saying that he thought the experiment had been thrown out and we weren't doing it anymore. And Reb got upset and he said, "I'm not teaching anymore." And then a lot of his, more diehard students were kind of like, apologize to Reb and get him to come back. And other people were like, no, we got to do something more experimental. And
What was the experiment?
that everything was optional, that the schedule was optional.
That experiment. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, and I was for the guy who upset Reb, I was a little bit on his side because everyone was kind of trashing him because he had upset Reb. And I was like, look, Reb has all the power here. Let's I like what this guy said. He's sincere, even if he did it in not such a good way, because he was a little rude, you know. And there was controversy, and it was kind of fun, but also it was like a lot of discussion. And you know, I think that was part of it too. I was like, I want something simpler.
And so you met Kokyo there.
Yeah. We became friends. There was a little group of people that were a little, I want to say like Zazen crazy. You know, we were sitting extra times during the free breaks and stuff.
Like night sitting and stuff.
Yeah. And I remember Coben was known for being Zazen crazy when he was at Aheiji. He would sit, because they don't sit a lot at Aheiji at all. It's like once a day. And like one session a year. Like it's pretty weak with that.
Yes, it just surprised me to hear that.
Yeah. So he would sit like a lot extra, and he had a little group of people that would do that. One of the other people has become a pretty well-known abbot of Hokkyo-ji, another monastery near Eheiji. Shinkai Roshi, I think his name is. I visited him when I was in Japan at one point. So he had been a friend of Koben's back then. So Coben was known for that in Eheiji. So we were trying to create a little of that at Tassajara, I think. Also, we were all vegan. We had all become strict with our diet, and that was kind of a special thing. Although I remember in a I guess it was a talent night. They had a talent night thing. We did a skit where we all like were drinking milk and drinking raw eggs and stuff, just to like, I guess, just to show we weren't detached and mess with people. But yeah, so we had a little group. Michael Dow is in that group. Leon, I forgot his last name. I don't know what's happening. I think I'm on Facebook friends with Michael Dow still, but I don't know what he's doing. And Leon went on to North Carolina and live in a community and build a Zendo there. And anyway, Kokyo is the only one I'm still really in touch with in that little group.
So at what point did you get ordained?
So at that point, I was really serious about practice, and I wanted to make it. I knew it was my full-time thing. I was just giving my life to it. But I thought ordination was just a silly ritualistic thing that was mostly for the ego. So I wasn't interested. I was like, I don't need to get ordained. I didn't want Jukai. I didn't want a Rakusu. I didn't want any of this kind of stuff. So that's probably my Krishnamurti background. You know, Krishnamurti is like really poo-poos all kinds of traditional religion. He's like, if you wake up to what's happening right now, it's just what's happening right now. You don't need any accoutrements. That's all for your ego, you know. And I took that to heart, and I think there's still a lot of truth in it, although there's also another side. So yeah, that's my mindset at that point. But so I wanted to go to Asia then and find hardcore practice. I also wanted to visit India, do the Buddhist pilgrimage. I had studied Indian religion and was probably drawn to that culturally more than any other place. I wasn't so into Japanese culture, what I knew about Japanese culture. And I wasn't even going to go to Japan, actually. I was just going to go to Korea to do a 3-month retreat with a Kwanum school. You know that school? So they have a pretty hardcore, it's a sesshin basically in silence for 3 months. That's their form of ango called Kholche. And that's kind of the hardest thing they do in the Kwanum school, but I just wanted to jump into that. And so I went to Berkeley. I met with Sung-san Sonsanim, their founder. He was still alive then. And we had a little interview. I remember he hit me pretty hard in the leg, but he said I could just jump in even though I wasn't part of the school. So I was all focused on doing that. And I met a guy at Tassajara because I was still there for the summer. I needed to make some money to get my plane ticket, so I had to stay another summer. And he said, I did the Kholche. It's great you're going to do that. It's a really great experience. He's like, since you're going all the way to Korea, why don't you check out this place in Japan? I know you're not so into Japanese style, but there's a really good practice place in Japan that's not very well known about, and an amazing teacher. And you can just check it out and then go on to Korea and continue with your travels. So that made sense to me. I was trying to, maximize what I could get out of my limited airline funds. So I went to Bukkoku-ji, and I was very impressed. And
this is Harada Tangen Roshi.
This is Harada Tangen Roshi, and
Uh-huh.
he was all the kind of classical things you might dream of with a Zen master.
Hmm.
Um, well, I don't know. People dream of different things. He wasn't very severe warrior like at all. He was always with a smile and very joyous and very buoyant. Well, he got mad too, for sure, but um, he was really so bright, just such a ball of life, you know. And the place was small, not very formal. All the things I didn't like about Japanese culture, like the hierarchy and the pecking order and the
Hmm.
solemnity and the severity and how, you know,
Hmm.
everyone seemed angry and all this kind of stuff. It wasn't like that there. The Japanese, it was about half Japanese and half people from other countries.
Hmm.
And the Japanese were all like dropouts that didn't fit in. Even they didn't fit in the priest world because you couldn't get a license at Bukkoku-ji. So the
Hmm.
Sotoshu had tried to get Tangen Roshi to make Bukkoku-ji a licensing temple, but he refused
Oh, I
because
didn't know that.
he didn't want people to come there for their license. He wanted people to come there just for zazen, for awakening, you know.
Huh.
And so it was really unusual Japanese and a lot of Westerners and a small place. It wasn't fancy. It didn't have a you know, a historic reputation, but the practice was strong and the teacher was strong, and so
Hmm.
that was really wonderful. So at first, I just experienced that for 2 months, and I still wanted to do what I had planned. So I went on to the retreat in Korea, which was a great experience and my first taste of koan, working with koans. Um,
Hmm.
and then I went on to India and did the pilgrimage and walked across the Himalayas and all these kind of exciting things you want to do in your 20s, and
Hmm.
or some of it anyway. and But it was actually in my time in India where I could see people that were visibly full-time spiritual practitioners in a traditionally accepted way, like with some robes and stuff, how they functioned in the culture to inspire the rest of the culture. Because I went to some pretty traditional places. I mean, you can see kind of traditional Hinduism, at least at that time, in pretty small villages. It's hard to see, or harder to see in the cities already. But
Hmm.
I also spent a lot of time in Ladakh, which is very northern Tibet on the other side of the Himalayas. So it's on the
Hmm.
Tibetan plateau, actually, and the culture is really Tibetan, and the ethnicity is really Tibetan, or much like Tibet. And there I went because I was away from roads for many days walk, you know, so I went to very remote villages, and you could really see an old culture like it had been. And they all had their little monastery and their lama, you know, and
Hmm.
it was just so beautiful. It was so beautiful to see. Just, I mean, not all of it having to do specifically with religion, just this traditional culture that welcomes any new stranger. And just the first thing they ask is, "Have you eaten? Can I feed you?" And the next thing they ask is, "Where are you sleeping tonight? Because it's late in the day. You sleep in my house." You know,
Hmm.
just kind of, and the smiles on their faces. You know, even though they had no money, they
Hmm.
didn't have such a conception, you know, until TV came in, they didn't have such a conception of being poor. They had nice houses and plenty of food to eat and animals, even though they lived in this high altitude red rock desert, basically. And it was just amazing. I mean, part of me just wanted to stay there.
Hmm.
But it really made an impact on me in terms of like getting ordained or being a priest or being a monk or being a, you know, some kind of full, you know, visible spiritual professional, we might say, was
Hmm.
not for me. When I thought it was for me, I was like, well, why bother? It's just ritual, it's the garbage. But when I realized it's for other people, it serves the community, then it really became beautiful. And I was like, oh, maybe I do want to do that. So it was actually when I came back from India and I went to visit Coben to check in. That's how Coben teaches. Like once a year, you check in with him. Maybe you'd sit a session with him. But he didn't like to live with his students like long term. You know, he wasn't that kind of teacher. He was more like a hermit artist kind of guy. That's what he liked to do. You know, he's calligrapher and poet and painter.
Hmm.
Um, so I check in with him, and uh, you know, I said, I now I kind of understand what that's about. I think I want to get ordained. First, actually, I brought it up. I had the idea I want to get ordained, so I brought it up with Mel first because I think I saw him first. And Mel said, "Yeah, I think you're a good candidate. I think, you know, you have a 5-year commitment with me, and then I'll ordain you, and then you have a 5-year commitment to stay on at some Zen center place."
Hmm.
And you know, then you're good to go or something like that. And I was like, I had already done the Tassajara thing. So I was like, 10 more years in Zen Center? I don't think so. I wasn't too excited about that. But I wanted to ask Coben also anyway. And I went to ask Coben. And I said, so what do you think about me getting ordained? He said, oh, finally, you ask. I mean, I was all of 24, you know?
Right.
So I was like, okay, I think I'm going to do it with Coben. I mean, I don't know what it's going to entail because Coben's a mystery, but He said, start sewing. So.
So was it? So you didn't do Jukai first. You went straight to.
Oh no, actually, at Bukkoku-ji. So I had no intention to do Jukai, but I was at Bukkoku-ji for that first 2 months before I had gone back to really train. That first 2 months, and there was a woman there who later ended up marrying my friend Leon, who was one of that crew from Tassajara. But she had been there 6 years already, and she was giving me, the senior person's little hints and stuff about life in the Japanese monastery. And there was going to be a Jukai ceremony for someone else the next day, for some woman, some older woman, Japanese woman from some town. She didn't live at the monastery. And when there's a Jukai ceremony, anyone can join, like even at the last minute. It's not the same kind of thing it's become in American Zen. So she said, I really think you should do this Jukai. And I'm like, oh, no, I'm not interested in this. She's like, no, there's something that happens. You make a connection with the teacher. And it's something very beautiful. Just do it. Don't throw your ideas about it away. I was like, okay. I was like, I'm game. I mean, whatever. And I asked Tangen Roshi, I was like, so can I do Jukai? And he says, oh yeah, I think that'd be good. And then I said, but I don't need a rakusu or anything. But I did want his calligraphy because he has beautiful calligraphy, and it's great to get calligraphy from a master. So I said, I'll give you a piece of cloth, right? And you could just do some calligraphy on it. Would that be okay? And he's like, oh, I have some old rakusu. I'm just going to give you a rakusu. I was like, oh, okay. And then he gave me this beautiful gold rakusu.
So had that rakusu?
Gold, green, I don't know, silk rakusu that someone had given him, And he did this beautiful enso on it and everything. And the woman, the old Japanese woman who was doing the ceremony with me, the night before, she just learned I was doing it the night, because I just decided the day before. She made this beautiful rakusu envelope out of an old kimono, the silk from an old kimono. I mean, it was so moving, So it was a.
Do you still have that rakusu?
I do, yeah. I've given away almost everything else, but I still have that.
Yeah.
But I didn't intend to do Jukai, but I happened to have done it, so that's what happened.
Was it in Japanese? Did you have any idea what you were agreeing to?
It was in Japanese. I probably had a good idea, a kind of intellectual mind. I'd asked people that could speak some Japanese, and yeah, I already had been at Tassajara, so I knew all the precepts and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, okay. All right, so you're back in the States. You got ordained by Kobun Chino. Was that do you think that did he, being kind of the eccentric that he was, did he give you like a full on ordination ceremony, or was it kind of his own kind of unique thing?
Yeah, a little of both. In some ways, he was really formal, like weirdly formal. I mean, in some ways, it was ad lib, Let's see. I was sewing with. I didn't know how to sew, so I was living at Chikoji at that time, and so I would go up to Zen Center, to San Francisco Zen Center, to get instruction for Blanche. She was pretty much the sole teacher. Blanche Hartman, yeah. And she had a deep connection with Coben. So any Coben student that was going to get ordained, she would help. She would tutor in sewing. So that was really nice. So I was sewing my robe, and I was full on at it, and I didn't have a job, so I could do it 8 hours a day. So in 1 month, I was half finished, I guess. And I went up for my next lesson, and I had it in this like cookie tin, and I was maybe in the Caltrain's station, and I went to make a phone call, and I sat back down, and then I had left it at the phone. So I said, oh, I left and I went up, and it was gone. So it got stolen. And it had a sheet of the precepts right on top. So whoever stole it, hopefully they read that a little bit. But I looked all over the garbage areas, because as soon as they opened the tin, this was up on the cloth, they would have thrown it out, but I couldn't find it. So I went to see Blanche. She's like, well, you got to start again tomorrow. So 2 more months, and I was done with that. And then Coben wanted me to come to New Mexico. That's where he happened to be at that time. So I went to Hokoji, the one in New Mexico, and had the ceremony there. And yeah, he had me come to his house in the morning, and I like put on gaita, the wooden shoes, and he gave me one kind of koromo that's before ordination, and it switches into another kind. So it was very formal in that way. But when it actually happened, he had me memorize the precepts and also Bodhidharma's comments on the precepts. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but they're kind of like the non-dual perspective of the precepts. He asked me about like the last one first. Like I had memorized, and I was a little nervous, but I was ready to go. But he asked me like the last one first or something, and so I recited them backwards. I remember that wasn't his intention, so everything went a little haywire. But he did a bunch of things in Japanese that I don't know what it was, and then got shaved, and that was that. Yeah. I had to
So
borrow someone's bowls. So
what's that?
technically, I had to borrow someone's bowls because I didn't have any money to buy those expensive oryoki bowls.
Right.
And years later, I read in some Dogen text that Dogen says if you borrow someone's bowls, it's not a real ordination. So, well,
You're a fraud. No, I'm just kidding.
yeah.
What so after you get ordained, did you stay with Kobun Roshi and practice for a while? What did you do at that point?
Well, there wasn't really a staying with Kobun Roshi. That's the thing. So if he had a place that way and he was training people, I probably would have. But he just does his private thing, and he leads a session here and there, and you never even know if he's going to show up at a session or not. And I wanted more formal training. I knew I needed it, and I wanted it. I was hungry for that. And I thought Bukkoku-ji was a wonderful place. So I went to him and I asked him, I said, I experienced this Bukkoku-ji place and it seems really great. And I'm thinking of going training there. And, would you let me? And is that okay? And I was trying to be the real obedient, formal student, which Coben doesn't really want particularly. But he said, yeah, if that sounds good, go there. He's like, but just be aware, it's a little weird in Japan when you go train with one teacher, but you've been ordained by another, because they think your ordination teacher owns you. So just, he gave me a little tutoring about that, but he's like, it should be okay, And so I went, and then the next 5 years, that's where I trained. I did come back in summers when not much was going on there, but most of the next 5 years I was training there.
What did your parents think about your career trajectory as a monk?
At the beginning, they were fairly open-minded. So they're like, "Oh, that's interesting. Study Buddhism, practice meditation."
Little phase you're going through.
Yeah, exactly. Phase is no problem, but they still wanted me to be the English professor and then the famous writer, as I had wanted to be. And I remember when I got ordained, I called up my mom and I said, "Hey, I've got the career, my lifetime career now. You should be very proud." Unfortunately, there's no income involved. She wasn't so excited.
Yeah.
But to their credit, they tried to be as open-minded and they tried to take seriously that they wanted what would make me happiest. And they were a little concerned, but I think they got used to it eventually. And I can talk a good game, so if they argued with me, it'd be difficult. And years later, it was interesting because my dad, when his health was already declining, he started opening up a little more. He was not a very emotionally open person. As a lot of men in our society aren't, and probably more so then. And he said, there was a phase. I noticed there was a D.T. Suzuki book in his bookshelf, like all the other intellectual stuff that's all basically Western. And he said there was a phase in his life where he could brush off conventional religion, but there was a phase where he could tell something in what he called mysticism. That was the old term for it, right? There was something there that seemed important and powerful, and that he couldn't explain off and couldn't explain away. And it intrigued him, but he didn't really know what to make of it, and he didn't really know how to go forward with it, so he never did. And so I got a little bit the feeling he was saying, like, I think you kind of took that on. That's something that I could never explore, and went farther with it. So I thought that was quite beautiful. I think at least by that time, they thought what I was doing was not something they can totally understand, but something that was had a beauty, and was okay.
So after getting ordained, I imagine there's a little bit of way over before you went to Japan. Like, where did you actually stay as a homeless?
Not much.
Yeah. Oh, you very much.
A couple months, probably at Jikoji. I can't really remember. So usually I'd stay at one of Coben's places, Hokoji or Jikoji, the Mexico or the California one. My brother, I think, lived in San Francisco at that time, so I could have stayed with him a little. But pretty soon I was off. I think I got ordained in the summer, and I was at the October session, I think, at Bukkoku-ji. And stayed on. And that was that. It's very simple at Bukkoku-ji. It's just that kind of place.
Can you paint a picture of like what a typical day is at Bukkoku-ji? Like what?
Yeah, the usual 3:50 wake up and zazen, And then, this was a little unusual. He was really into physical fitness, or more so than most traditional places anyway. And so he had us all run. I guess he used to run, but at that time he was in his 70s and he wasn't running anymore. But we all ran. So it was through the dark streets of the town in the early morning, and then came back for some calisthenics, and then went back into the Zendo for a second period, and then chanting, which is about an hour in Japan. It's a little more full than usual in the States. And that was a real physical practice too, chanting. He really emphasized from the tanden, what's called the hara, but tanden being a little more accurate term, dantian in Chinese. That really full energy in your chanting, full energy in your bowing. We really learned how to bow correctly, which you don't often in America. And yes, that was a wonderful practice. And you have to be vigorous, and especially in the winter, because it's still dark out. There's no heating. The doors of the Hondo, the main hall, are all open. You can't wear anything on your head. You can't wear anything on your hands. You can't wear anything on your feet. And we're all getting chilblains, little sores on our fingers and stuff. And especially during the Buddhas and ancestors, right? That chant, you have to keep your hands like this. The rest of the time, you can put them in your sleeves and keep a little warmer. But so it was very vigorous. And then, there was not a lot of work. So that was interesting to me, because often in America, they say, this is a Japanese thing. It's a Japanese training technique to have a lot of work, to do a lot of samu. But that wasn't my experience at all. It was a small temple. We didn't have much to do. So an hour in the morning and an hour and a half in the afternoon was work period. The rest of the time, he wanted us to just go in the Zendo and sit. So there was 3 scheduled periods in the evening, so 5 periods a day. But he would emphasize, and we had quite a bit of free time, and he would just say, on your free time, you should just go sit more. And I would try to do that. So,
well, was there dokusan every day or multiple times a day?
When I first got there was probably a dokusan every day, yeah. Or every other day or something like that. And then sesshin would be, I think my first session with him was maybe 3 times a day, at least twice a day, but maybe 3 times a day. So a lot of, as I stayed on those years, his body started getting weaker, and he definitely was less active. And it got to be, maybe outside of session, maybe dokusan once a week, still twice a day during session. So he would really work himself up for session. And there was about 20 to 30 people that lived at the monastery, but there would be about 60 for session from all over the world. And there was no room in the small temple, so they were stuck in the Hondo and the office and wherever they could fit. It was a lot of people. Really interesting. From all over the world. Rinzai, Soto, didn't matter, because this is a Soto Rinzai mixed lineage, right? And it was really exciting. He was really deeply appreciated in Japan as one of the greatest living masters still alive, because he was, the founder of the Soto Rinzai mixed lineage is Daiun Sugaku Roshi.
Right.
Yeah, and Tangen Roshi was the last living heir. He was the youngest, the final one that Daiun Sugaku gave transmission to. So he was a Dharma brother of Yasutani Roshi, for example, but Yasutani was much older. And so he was still in his 70s here, although all the other disciples had basically died. So that carried a lot of clout. I mean, the last living heir of one of the most famous Zen masters of the 20th century. But he didn't. He just taught from his own heart, his own experience. He hardly ever quote. He would do little quotes here and there, but he mostly just talked about how wonderful it was to walk out and feel the sun on your face, and how can you be ignoring that and be filled with all your thinking? It's just very, very direct, and always on the point of just this present moment, waking up, and that's what inspired me. So I was so happy to hear that, even though he spoke in Japanese most of the time and I didn't speak Japanese, but it got translated. There was a translator that would come fairly frequently. And so eventually, what's that?
Was there a translator in dokusan?
Sometimes, if you requested it, yeah, that would be less frequently. She would be there for the sessions she was a disciple of Tangen Roshi, but she was married to a priest of another sect, and she lived in another temple in the town. And she would come, she was an American woman, and she would come be there all day for the sessions, or then probably went back to her temple to sleep. And she would translate the talk every day, but you'd have to ask if you wanted to translate it or translated Doksan. But he had enough English to give his simple answers. It was always simple answers.
Well,
More here, only let go. This kind of thing, and then ring you out.
what did
So
what was your practice there? Did you do Bu or did you do Shikantaza, or what was
I
your?
started with Shikantaza because that's what I had been doing, and that was my kind of heart's connection. But because he really thought it was better for most people to do Mu first, he thought
Mhm,
Shikantaza was a practice that, is really advanced, and to do in its true sense, you have to really have some insight already.
mhm,
That's kind of, I guess it varies with all the different teachers, but that Soto Rinzai mixed lineage kind of has that outlook.
mhm,
Um, and so he thought it was best for most people to do Mu, just because it gives you something more concrete to work with. It gives you something, it's harder to just sit there and daydream.
mhm,
He called it like a sword to cut off the thinking. So it gives you a little more power by saying Mu, especially with your breath to yourself.
mhm.
We did do the quite famous practice from Hoshinji, his teacher's monastery, which was next door. And it's famous even in America because of Philip Kapleau's books describing it. But where in the evening, usually the last period of Zazen, everyone does Mu out loud, their whole breath, their whole exhale for a whole period of sitting, as loud as they can. So your ears are like, and then they hit the bell to end the period. They have to hit it really hard so you can hear it. And then it's just silence. And like everything is like vibrating. It's just amazing. So we did that practice. And the Doksan style was the Doksan bell would go off and you jump off your cushion and run to Doksan. So it was kind of Rinzai style Sanzen kind of.
Mhm. And
So it was a lot.
were the meetings pretty quick? Like, were you in and out pretty quick?
Yeah, yeah. So if you wanted to discuss some issue like about your life direction, that would usually be a Dokusan outside of session,
Mhm,
and then you'd ask the translator to come in with you to help you make sure that you can. Or
mhm,
if you had some real complicated problem you wanted to discuss, you could do that. But if you're just working on your practice, you come in and you just say a Japanese line that says, "I'm working on Mu" or "I'm working on Shikantaza," and
mhm.
he says he already knows your mind state from the way you hit the response bell online. So the rest of it is kind of unnecessary. So yeah, they were quick. So I did try Move because he wanted us to for about a year. I worked on that, um, but I just didn't resonate with it so much. So eventually I went back to Shikantaza, and he didn't like that so much. But soon he forgot that I had done Mu, and it didn't matter.
My
So
understanding is you couldn't pass Mu with him either, no matter what. It's just
he didn't pass anyone. No, no.
more Mu. Yeah.
His style was, well, he would say that, when you really pass Mu, you pass everything.
Hmm.
If your awakening is really clear, then all koans would be you just answer them immediately. Maybe that's how it was for him. He passed Mu and then he could just answer any koan.
Hmm.
But I never heard of anyone working on any other koan there.
Hmm.
I mean, he had a couple of people. He had one lay guy that he had empowered to teach, but not full on. Like
Hmm.
that person was supposed to, any real promising student that person had was supposed to send them to Tangen Roshi at Bukkoku-ji for like finishing. And then there was a priest, one of his early students, who had gone on to actually teach in Spain for a while, and now I think he's still teaching probably in Australia. So he has
Hmm.
mostly Western. I'm forgetting his name at the moment, but and I don't know the level of teaching authority he had from Tangen Roshi or not, but you never heard that he had a real Dharma
Hmm.
air that he was satisfied with. And so
Right.
some people might think that, well, he just didn't get a good enough student, or he was too strict and he didn't allow any, or he didn't, want anyone to get on his level, or who knows. But the way I take it is just he didn't want us to get that gaining mind of stages and
Hmm.
getting an ego, because of course you can have big opening experiences and your ego's still there and it comes back. And if you have a big fancy title and a big fancy transmission, it's going to be part of it. And some people can work with that well and not get a big head, but
Hmm.
I think he was just like, don't worry about it. Just give your life to practice, just give your life to this moment. So that I thought was just so beautiful. So I didn't really care.
Mhm. Um, so you had said earlier, so did you overlap with Kokyo or Jiryo from Jiryo? Am I saying that right? The Green Gulch priest.
What was your question? I'm sorry about them.
Jiryo, is it Ruchman Bayer? I don't think I've ever said his name out loud. Now I think about it. Jiryo Ruchman Bayer.
Yeah, I know him. What's the
Yeah.
question?
Oh, did you overlap with his day or with
Oh
Kokyo
no,
at
he
all?
was yes with Kokyo. I mean, Kokyo came there, I think, largely because of me, as far as I know. I don't think he knew about Bukkoku-ji before my telling him. I had already been there, I think, at least 3 years,
Mm-hmm.
and we were in correspondence. When I come back to the States, I would see him. He was my oldest Zen friend,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, I told him how great this place was, and he wanted to taste some Japanese thing. So he came one of my last years. He came for a year.
Mm-hmm.
And we got to do Takahatsu together because he had never experienced that. That's the begging rounds.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and I think he was quite enthused with
Mm-hmm.
the whole spirit and with Tangen Roshi as well. He
Mm-hmm.
was more, of course, he had been years in the Zen Center system by that time and had a real deep relationship with Tenshin Roshi. And so, um, uh, for him, I think it was a little more like there were these two different worlds. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have much rooted in the States anymore. I mean, I had a relationship with Coben, but he was so informal that didn't have any like structure to it, really.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think over the years, I think his time at Bukkoku-ji has even grown in his mind. Because it really was a special place, and there's very, very few places. Even then, there was very few places like that. I remember in those days they would say there's almost no other place that Westerners can practice in that have this kind of serious practice. But
Mm-hmm.
now I hear there's not even places the Japanese can go. Really,
Mm-hmm.
it's dramatically uh, disappeared. My understanding now, there's almost no training centers left in
Yeah,
Japan.
maybe
So this
Sogenji with a Harada.
right, but all his students are Westerners, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think everyone, as far as I know.
Yeah.
So he's keeping the nice big temple he gets to have there, but
Mm-hmm.
I think his students are all foreigners. I
Mm-hmm.
did a couple sessions with him on Whidbey Island up here in
Oh,
Washington,
okay.
Northwest.
What do you think about him?
Well, he was good. He was strong. I mean, I had just come from Bukkoku-ji, and Tangen Roshi is a really hard act to follow.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Tangen Roshi is kind of like a saint. I mean, he's just like. I mean, of course, I don't know the details of his private life, so I don't mean to idolize anyone or who knows what was really going on in his mind. But his demeanor was just so buoyant and so unconstrained by any structure. I mean, he never lectured on a text or anything. He was just like, life is just magic. And so that was really amazing. And Shoto Roshi, Harada Shoto Roshi is more traditional in that way. I mean, he'll lecture on a text, and I was falling asleep during the lectures, to be honest. I mean, you don't sleep much in those places, so that's part of it. But his Sanzen was strong, as I remember.
Mm-hmm.
But it always seemed a little theatrical to me. I also practiced. I did a session with Josu Sasaki Roshi back in the day. The old guy since gone through tons of scandals and whatever before he passed
Right.
away at 107 or whatever. Um, but whatever else you might say about him, he was a strong teacher, a powerful presence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I enjoyed that session with him, although he knocked down my overinflated ego about being this great young Zen student at the time because he didn't pass me on anything. I thought I could pass all koans by that time. This was right after Tassajara, right? And he was a tough cookie with me, but we had kind of a fun time in
Mm-hmm.
Sanzen. But anyhow, even with them, it just seemed theatrical. It just seemed, the Ino or the equivalent to the Ino, I think they're called Jikajitsu in the Rinzai tradition. They have to be this really mean guy and scream at everyone. But it's all an act. It's all theater. And if it's theater, it's just a little hard to take seriously. And
Mm-hmm.
every Rinzai place I've been seems a little bit like that. But
Mm-hmm.
the Bukkoku-ji wasn't like that. It had that same spirit, but you didn't feel like anyone was putting on a role that they're supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So
that's
I'm curious.
not offensive to anyone, but I mean, there's a
It's,
point to putting on roles. They do things for people, so it might be great.
yeah, it's the structure. It's
Yeah.
templates. Yeah. So you'd kind of when you were at Tassajara, you thought, I want to go and I'm going to find like a fully realized master and study with him. I mean, do you think Tangen Roshi was fully realized? I mean, would you characterize him that way, or do you think or do you not even think about it that
I
way?
don't think the term has any, I don't think the term
What's
has any
that?
meaning to it.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I don't think that term fully realized has any reality to it. I mean, I don't know what, I think people mean different things by it. I think no one knows what they mean by it. So was he mature? Can you say that this person seems more mature than this person? Sure. You know, can you say this person has a deeper realization of a truth that is beyond the intellect? Sure. You know, of course you can. But, you know, how to judge and rank that and who has what, and, you know, you can usually say if you get to know someone, you can usually say this person's more mature than me. And that's all you need to practice with them, you know, as far as I know. Then if you feel like, well, maybe they're not anymore, go find someone else. You know? But is there a line of fully realized, you know, I mean, I think the Zen tradition has recognized that, even though the first phase of the Zen tradition talks a lot about full realization and this kind of these things, I think they're just they're make believe. And when you hear that, like the Zen phrase Shakyamuni Buddha today, still today, is only halfway done, that's what that's. Yeah. We have to let go of these boundaries, you know. I mean, when you understand that maturing yourself as deep as you can for the rest of your life, no matter where you get to, that's the only thing worth doing. Then you don't be evaluating these lines anymore. You know, it just becomes a little silly. So I don't know what he was, but he was inspiring to me. I could say he was more mature than me at that time, at least as it appeared to me. And he inspired me, and I practiced. And
so you were there for 5 years. I'm sorry, say it again.
And Coben inspired me too, but in a different way. Coben started showing his lack of confidence in some ways to me, which is very human, and we all have. And I think teachers that hide that and pretend to be confident all the time are much less reliable. So it was something really beautiful in Coben. And I take that lesson from him, and I try to, it's hard for me to make myself look vulnerable and weak. You know, I've certainly noticed that in my own character. So, but I really try to. I think that's a really sign of maturity and beauty. So I got in my last years of Coben, I got to see that a little bit in him, and I don't think he tried to hide it so much, you know, and that was really beautiful. Tangen Roshi was more, because he was a Zen master in a Zen place, you know, you didn't see his vulnerability so much, but he was just like a little kid. I mean, always completely confident, but always like, but silly too. And you know, he didn't take such care of his like robes and stuff. He didn't follow a lot of the like strict Soto can get a little wrapped up in its form. It's a way of teaching mindfulness moment to moment, but it's not the only way mindfulness can look. You can also walk fast. You can also drag your okesa on the floor a little bit, you know, which Tangen Roshi did. It was great for me to see both sides, you know.
So you were there for 5 years. What got you to leave?
Oh, it wasn't as exciting anymore. It wasn't as I didn't feel like I was growing much anymore. First couple of years, I felt I was growing. I think you grow the most when you feel like you're giving something up. You know, you're giving something up and diving into a new world, and you're willing to do that. That's when it's most exciting, and also when you're really transforming more. But after a while, I got used to it. Sessions were not hard. That daily practice was not hard. You know, I'd go back to the States and people hear what I'm doing. They're like, oh my God, it's so amazing. I was like, no, it's just daily life. It's just simple. And I really felt I understood Tangen Roshi's teachings. I mean, he just said the same thing over and over again, as many great teachers do. I mean, it's not so much to talk about. When we asked whether we should learn Japanese so we could chat with him more in detail, he was like, no, you already have such a problem with English. Why are you talking in English all the time? He's like, don't learn another language.
That's funny.
He's like, you already hear my teaching. You just have to do it, you know? And that's what I really felt. And so I felt at that point, I knew I would keep practicing. There are a lot of people I've since learned, you know, it's just my character that I've really internalized the practice. But a lot of people, if they leave a practice place like that, they stop practicing. And some of them know that. And so they don't want to leave because they're afraid of stop practicing. And that kind of makes sense. But for me, I knew I would keep practicing every day. I knew it was the focus of my life. But I felt like I wasn't growing so much at the monastery anymore. Tangen Roshi was getting weaker. He was kind of pulling back and teaching less. And it was getting a little rote for me. And also, to be honest, I'd never been in a romantic relationship, which I thought that will be a big learning for me. I should probably check that out. And can't do that at Bukkoku-ji. At least I thought in my a little bit naive mind, I was very straight and narrow at the Bukkoku-ji. But at the end, I started learning about some other American monks there who had been escaping during the night and had relationships with people in town and stuff like that. I don't know how they did it. They'd come back for Zazen at 3:50 in the morning, but and people would watch movies on their free time, you know, when they're saying they're doing something else in town. But I never did. I was very innocent that way. But so by the end of 5 years, I was like, okay, I think I need to expand my life a little, and I wanted to see what form it would take in my own culture. I was also kind of done with Japanese culture. I never resonated with it that much, and so I didn't really want to spend 20 years in Japan. It just didn't seem right to me. Felt like Tangen Roshi was an amazing teacher, but I had heard his teachings and he was kind of sliding into retirement. So I felt grateful for that, but I felt finished with the monastic thing. I mean, I wasn't quite, because I went to China and I went to some monasteries in China.
Oh, you did?
That I had.
Like directly, or
yeah.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about that experience?
Whole other story. I had tried first time on a boat, and they didn't let me in the country because was wearing monk's robes and didn't have any money, and they didn't like that. They sent me back on the boat. A year later, I got a visa in San Francisco for China, so I could make sure I could get in. I took the boat again from Japan, and that time I got in. And
you mean China?
What's that?
You said Japan. You mean boat to China?
Boat to China from Japan, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so at that time, there were only 3 monasteries that had revived a strict and well-regarded Zen practice, you know, because it had kind of been obliterated during the Cultural Revolution. And some of the masters that had studied with, like the famous master Shu Yun, Empty Cloud, kind of revived Zen in the 20th century, but then kind of got squashed again during the Cultural Revolution. Some of his students were still alive, but they had hid out in caves, you know, for years. And then in the 90s, the government was pretty lax about it. They came back out of the caves and went to these monasteries. So it was just this exciting vibe about Chinese Zen returning, you know. So I found out the places to go, and I went to at least one of them. I got someone to write, you know, I wrote a letter, and I got someone to translate it into Chinese, send it off, and they were happy for me to come. So I went there. I just ended up spending a couple of weeks there, which I regret. I was kind of having a hard time with my mind, actually. I had been pushing myself so hard, and I kind of was done with that style of pushing. But if you do that, sometimes your mind can do strange, scary things. So I was starting to have some OCD tendencies, which I can sometimes have when under stress or when pushing myself. So I was a little worried about if I stayed there, would it be healthy? Because it was basically just sitting all day, you know, it was just session all the time.
Okay, so it's pretty serious practice.
What's that?
It was pretty serious, strict practice.
It really was, but it's one of the reasons I want to go to China is to see what was constant about serious Zen practice, but what was just a Japanese cultural thing and not the same cultural thing. And there was quite a lot that's just cultural about Japanese Zen. I kind of suspected that already. Well, I had practiced with the Koreans a bit, so I could see that it was a little different because I had done that 3-month Kyoche in Korea with Sung-san. And so I wanted to see how it was in China. And it's really different. I mean, they don't have that strict, cold demeanor when you first enter, you know? They're just smiling and laughing more. And they give you hugs. And they kind of yell across the room. They're much more like Americans. They're not very formal, you know. But the sitting was strong, you know. They're just sitting all day in the Zendo. And the Zendo's like all dirty and things are like falling apart and it's not like all kept spick and span. That's also a Japanese thing, you know. And we didn't start as early. I think we just started at 6 in the morning, maybe 5 in the morning. But we went to 11 at night. And there was no chanting. Like the other monks, you know, in China, it's not a separate Zen temple. It's just a general Buddhist temple. There's a Zen hall. If you're in the Zen hall, that's like you're a high-class monk because that's considered the hardest life. But the other monks do the work, and the other monks do the chanting and do the ceremonies for lay people. Even the chanting for meals, the other monks would do, and we would come in late into the cafeteria and get our food, and then just leave in silence and go back to the Zendo, you know. There's all kinds of differences. Their kinhin was really different. It was really interesting. They do these funny kind of shuffling movements, and they make sounds. And it's a lot about qi cultivation. It's really influenced by Taoism and qigong. and they didn't eat dinner, which is really kind of cool. I didn't learn that till I was there, and at first I was worried. I was like, "Uh-oh, just 2 meals a day," but actually they had snacks that went around the Zen in the evening, lots of snacks. It was like dumplings and all kinds of things. So it was actually fine.
All vegetarian, I assume.
It was vegan, yeah. It's probably the oldest vegan culture in the world. I
Yeah.
assume the Chinese Buddhists.
Was it so I mean, were there like noodles and rice and tofu, or was it pretty simple?
Lunch was, I guess, kind of. You're talking about China, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, lunch was probably a little fancy, but not very fancy. But I definitely remember the fake meats. You know, that's a big thing in Chinese vegan cooking. They
Mhm.
make fake meats, and they were so authentic tasting. I was like, I think they made a mistake. I think there's real chicken in here. It was kind of crazy. I mean,
Even has like the texture of the skin where the
exactly. They make it from yuba, from the
right.
skin on soy milk, and they fry it separately. It was crazy. So we definitely had that sometimes for lunch.
Mhm,
The dinners thing in this endo was a little more simple, and
mhm,
it wasn't orioki or anything. You just got handed this like dumpling, you know, with some veggies in it. Or they had fresh soy milk, I think, in the evening sometimes, and they had this drink with like medicinal like fruits and nuts in it. It was really good, also in the evening. So things like that. But yeah, it was a little greasy, as I remember, like Chinese food can tend to be.
yeah.
Yeah.
So you left there and you went back to the States directly?
Yes, finally. I went to Hong Kong and I wasn't sure whether I was going to go to another monastery in China and that's all these other things I wanted to do in China. I think I had a intuition that if I went back to the States, I was done with my travel part of my life. You know,
Mhm,
I wasn't coming back. So it's kind of like I should get everything in, you know, a little bit greedy mind.
mhm,
Uh, but I wasn't doing so well. My mind was not so clear. And I met a woman, really wonderful woman. She was an airline attendant, so that was good in knocking down my preconceived notions about people. You think airline attendants are, I don't know, not the most deep people or something. But that's so
mhm,
kind of dead. Anyway, she was a Buddhist practitioner, and I met her in some veggie cafe on Lama Island, I think, which is in Hong
mhm,
Kong. And she really had deep respect for me and my practice and asked me some Buddhist questions. I was very good at answering all these Buddhist questions. But um, but then when she got to know me better, she knew I was under some stress and strain and that kind of at a life changing point. She was like, "You should go home. If you're not able to fully fulfill your bodhisattva vow of freeing all beings right now, you need to strengthen up." And it was so lovely hearing that from someone who wasn't a, you know, she was practicing Tibetan Buddhism, but she wasn't, you know, didn't think of herself as a high level practitioner or anything.
mhm,
But just this heart resonance. And then I was like, yeah, you're probably right, but I don't have any money and I maybe have credit on Korean Air. If I wait like several weeks, I can be standby and I don't know what I'll do between then. She's like, I have a flight the day after tomorrow and you can come as my guest for free.
mhm,
And she, first class, she took me back to San Francisco, you know, so sweet. And I remember I went back to Jikoji, and a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months later, she came to Santa Cruz to do a retreat at Land of Medicine Buddha, I think it was. And I went down to see her, and she was discussing with friends about what a bodhisattva was, you know, very complicated philosophy in Tibetan Buddhism.
mhm,
I said, no, you know what a bodhisattva really is? What you did for me, flying me back on that plane when I was having a hard time. Yeah. So
mhm,
I wish I had stayed in touch with her, but
mhm.
I'm not good at
So what did you do at that point? Did you stay at practice center still, or like?
Well, yeah, I mean that's all I knew to go to. So I was
Mhm,
at Chikuchi for a little while, and then someone else there was driving up to the northwest, and I'd heard about Harada Shodo Roshi. That's when I did. I was like, well, I guess I'll go up there. I wasn't really eager, but I was like, I'll see someone else's style, you know. And
mhm,
so I went and did a couple sessions with him on Whidbey Island. And then just one thing led to another. Like I met this really great guy. I could just go on and on. I don't usually talk about my history so much, but now that you've tweaked it, it's like all coming out. But there was this great guy named Nils Holm. He's since passed away, and he was an early student of Suzuki Roshi. He had
mhm,
a crazy life. He left at home in Denmark. He's from Denmark. I think at 15, he went out on a as a merchant marine, you know, too young, on a ship around the world, and
mhm,
he jumped ship in India, you know, before the hippies went to India, and had done all these things. But eventually, he found himself in San Francisco and met Suzuki Roshi and was one of his early students at Tassajara.
mhm.
And he was very close friends with the first person Suzuki Roshi ever ordained, whose name is Silas.
Oh,
Silas, yeah.
yeah.
And he actually never got ordained, and through much of the rest of his adult life, he always had this big question in his mind. He should have gotten ordained with Suzuki Roshi, but he never did. But he was there in those early years. And since then, he had done all kinds of crazy things. And so at this point, he's living at Port Townsend in northern, the Olympic Peninsula in Washington, on the northeast corner of that peninsula. And he was an artist and a sculptor and a house builder. And he built this house that he lived in and had crazy expressive art. And he loved like Gaudi, for example, and Hundertwasser, if anyone knows these artists, very expressive, kind of radical artist. And he had a zendo he had built in the basement of his house. And he had a daily sitting, and he had a Sunday group that would have discussions that start on kind of spiritual things, but then would go all crazy places. And there's a bunch of really interesting people that live in Port Townsend, including some famous translators of like Zen poetry. Red Pine, for example, lives there, Bill Porter. And, he was friends. He was part of this circle. And Michael O'Connor, I think is his name. I hope I'm remembering right. I might be forgetting. He's passed away as well, but he's translated several Chinese Zen poets. And so they were part of this little Zen circle. So anyhow, Nils had come to the session on Whidbey Island with Shoto Harada and met me. And we had some talk, and I was like, I don't know where I'm going next. And he said, well, you should come to my house and be the priest in residence of my zendo. I said, okay. And so that's what I was for the next few months. And I met all these crazy people. I met Red Pine, and that was really fun. And but eventually I left there, and I was getting involved in environmental activism already. So I started to learn about the kind of radical direct action stuff, tree sitting to try to preserve old growth forests and stuff that was going on. And I was like, oh, that would be a good thing. I had an opportunity to meet, maybe before I came to the Northwest, Julia Butterfly Hill. I don't know if you've ever heard of her. She got famous. I guess it was the late 90s when she sat in the redwood for a long time. Actually, a lot of activists have sat in tall trees, as I have. Usually not for as long, but she got famous for it and wrote a book about it. So I met her and she had a real spiritual perspective about activism as well. So I met her in California, and I said, I don't know what I'm doing with myself now. I'm this priest back from training in Japan, and I really want to help preserve the forest, but also want to spread this practice. I'm thinking of like going out and tree sitting, but like teaching people meditation. She's like, that's a great idea. That's what you should do. So I had that in my mind. And so I got involved. I went down to Olympia, Washington. I had my first girlfriend there. So I was trying to explore that, which I'd never done. And even though I was, in my 30s already, and got involved in some of this direct action stuff, and eventually ended up in Portland and doing tree sitting in various trees down the coast, and just never left Portland, actually.
You how long did you stay at No Abode Zendo, or how long did you stay there?
Oh yeah, forgot about No Abode. So that was, I think I had already landed in Portland, at least briefly, before Kokyo and Helen started that. I think so, but it was early on, right when it was getting started. Because I think I took a bike trip. I biked from here down to Green Gulch, and I met Kokyo there, and I think he was discussing it then, like, we're going to buy this place, and it's going to be more strict practice, and we were psyched about that, and he invited me to join. So I think I probably went back up here first, but eventually I went down there and joined them. I was never there for longer than I think 3 or 4 months at a time. And I'd come and go, kind of. But we did the first begging practice together, because I had done it for years, and Kokyo had done it for a year at Bukkoku-ji. And everyone said, oh, you can't do that in America because, it's a different culture and everything. And, we didn't buy that. So we just dressed up full on Japanese garb with the hat and everything. And we walked down the hill to Mill Valley and stand in front of Whole Foods. We wouldn't chant because we thought that might be a little too weird. We just stood there. And people would come and just put their food in our bag. It worked fine, And
Kokyo was saying, like, you guys discovered this, or maybe you weren't there at the time. They discovered like this fruit stand, and they would give all the like old fruit. Yeah.
They were like from El Salvador or something, so we learned how to say our little thank you phrase in Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
I can remember it. No, I can't remember it. But yeah, we learned it just for them because they would always give us fruit from their fruit stand. People would give so much. Once we went into San Francisco and did it in different neighborhoods. And the rich neighborhoods, and this is true in Japan too, this is true everywhere. The rich neighborhoods, they wouldn't give you a thing and they pretend they're not home and whatever. We were walking down like Market Street in San Francisco, like in a kind of low income neighborhood, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and people who very unlikely to have any introduction to Buddhism, you know, and also probably didn't have very much any at all, would just see us. Would just see us like walking down the street mindfully in these funny rows. And they would see our bowls, you know, and they just come and put some money in it. They'd be like, what do you want? You want some money? You want some food? What do you want?
Hmm.
You know, and we'd speak a little. We'd be like, well, whatever you want to give, if you want, you know, and they would just give. And just there's something so universal about it. It's just that was a really beautiful lesson. Doesn't have to be culture. It doesn't matter, you know.
That's fascinating. I wonder what do you think the psychology behind that is? Like classism, you know, afraid of.
Yeah, I think everyone in their heart knows that there's something more meaningful to life. And if they get caught up in the game of trying to get ahead, they know it's unsatisfying. They might not be able to extricate themselves from that addiction, but somewhere in your heart, you know it's unsatisfying. And I think people with more money generally are more caught up in the game,
Mm-hmm.
and it's hard for them to let go. And they have to look down at other people in order to justify what they've done. So, you know, I don't care about these poorer people or these weird people or whatever. I'm playing the society game and I'm successful at it, so I don't have to pay attention. And I think that's sad. Whereas poorer people, they know to rely on community. They know that there's something more deep in this game that hasn't treated them very fairly. You know, it's more
Mm-hmm.
clear to them that it's a losing game. You know, even
Mm-hmm.
though the rich people are losing too, maybe even more. I think more. You know, but so I think they see someone doing something idealistic and something beautiful,
Mm-hmm.
something that comes from the heart, not from that game, and they want to support it.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I could say it in as few words as possible, I think.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah.
So what was your transition from kind of that cloud and water existence and wandering around to a more fixed abode where you are now? Like how did that come about?
You never made the intentional transition. I didn't mean to stay in Portland. You know, I grew up in Manhattan and I always loved nature. So I thought that was it for the city for me. But here I am. It's easy to survive on nothing in a city if you know the ropes, you know, easier than in the country anyway, I think, unless you already have solid community. So I just found myself in Portland. I connected first with the activists, through them with Food Not Bombs, this, you know, also kind of an activist organization that gathers food that would go to waste and distributes it
Mm-hmm.
to whoever needs. They're a movement all over the world. They have over 1,000 chapters. And there's no organization in charge. It's just kind of an anarchist movement. Just volunteers do it, and their own chapter organizes and stuff. So there was a good one here in town, and us tree sitters would be fed by them basically. So after tree sitting started to wind down, I got involved in that. So I always had plenty of food for myself and my immediate community, and we'd be giving it out to whoever.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I lived homeless quite a bit. You know, I thought, well, this is originally how the Buddha taught. You know, I took that very seriously. You know, a monk is a home leaver, and they live homeless, and they don't have possessions, and that's the way it was taught. And I don't know what had happened to that. So I thought, well, I'm going to try to do it, and I didn't find it very hard. Of course, there's things you have to give up. Social things. I mean, the material things I didn't even really notice. I was young and healthy, and I was eating enough food, and you know, I'm a big backpacker in my life, so I'm used to living outside. So that was all easy. Socially, it's, you know, you become a little limited, and there's some loneliness there. So that was an issue. But I was able to plug into community enough. So sometimes during the rainy season, or most of the time during the rainy season, I'd have places to stay inside, maybe moving from place to place. But people would put me up.
Do you ever go to any like rainbow gatherings or anything like that?
Yeah, I did. In 2004, I went to the first one. Someone drove me down. It was near Shasta, and I think it was the biggest ever, probably because its proximity to the Bay Area.
I remember that one actually. I didn't go, but I remember people talking about it.
Yeah, And so I went there ostensibly to teach meditation, you know, as a full-time practitioner. I wasn't going to just go have fun, make plans, just having fun, right? So I was like, well, I'll teach meditation. That'll be good. And they had a yoga camp with like 4 different platforms, 3 or 4 different platforms, and like yoga classes constantly all day. It was just amazing, and everything for free, and the food was for free. And so I taught meditation, and I had like at 8 in the morning, which is really early for a rainbow crowd, right? Because everyone's partying all night and tripping and whatever. But at 8 in the morning, I had like 10, 12 people come for, you know, an hour of sitting or something. It was amazing. And yeah, and I really thought, this is a really beautiful example of how anarchism, which I consider the Buddha's original Sangha to be anarchist, you know, in a kind of a deeper sense. This is it really working. Everyone's getting fed for free, you know, and there was some privileged people there, but there was some street kids that had a really tough time that were there, and they come and they have an attitude, you know, but after they're just like accepted and fed, they start volunteering to clean the dishes, and it's just, it really works beautifully, I thought, you know. I mean, of course, it has all kinds of problems, but as anything does. But I was impressed. So I went to several after that and always taught meditation at the yoga camp.
That's cool.
Until once I led a walk from here, when it was really near here, the national gathering was in near Mount St. Helens, only about 80 miles north of Portland. So I led a walk of about 10 people. We just walked, you know, over a week or so to the
That's
gathering.
Cool. How about Burning Man? Do you ever make it down there?
I never did.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's beautiful things there too, but I always had a negative idea about it because it costs money and you have to bring food. So it's very different from the Rainbow Gathering that's free and you get fed. Yeah. So I felt that's less sustainable and there's alcohol involved, whereas I thought it was a really good move that at Rainbow Gatherings they don't allow alcohol. I mean, there's lots of pot and lots of hallucinogens, but alcohol does tend to make a little more conflict and
right
kind of thing. So yeah, but you know, I think that spirit can be interesting. And Coben's senior student, Vanya Palmers, I don't know if you know of him, but I know that he's had some kind of temporary Zen temple put up at Burning Man several times in years past. So
that's cool.
Some things like that, yeah.
So these days, you're do you have a job? Like, how are you supporting yourself?
No, I kind of, when I got ordained, my own vow was a little more traditional than the Japanese Zen lineage thing has become. And although I never felt like I wanted to take a celibacy vow because I didn't really see the point in that, I did want to take a serious vow of poverty and never work for money again. And never charge for money and just never enter into that part of society that has to be about credit and debt and struggling to play the game in order to survive. I didn't believe that humans have to live that way. I think maybe most inspired, I mean, I always had that, as far as I can remember, I always had that idealization, you know, but when I saw in Ladakh, in northern India, people living in villages there without money and just taking care of each other and working together, I was like, oh, it really can happen, you know? And then maybe Rainbow Gathering is another temporary example of it really happening, you know, even though it might not be able to work full time in that situation. So but I really wanted to be an example of that if it can be done at all. So I've never worked for money since then. So I never had a job and I just, you know, would wander around, but usually within Portland, you know, because I biked to California a couple of times and I did these walks and I led trips out to the mountain to backpack on bike. And, but you can't go that far afield if you're trying not to spend money much. So it was pretty local, but it was still kind of floating around for a long time.
So this house, do you have the deed to it, or how does that work?
Do I have a what to it? Did you say?
The house, like, do you own this house? Like, how does that work?
No. So you know, if you're involved in this practice and if you keep trying to be involved in the community and offer what you can, you meet people and they have various levels of financial treasures and you know, sometimes they take care of you that way, in a financial way. So Helen, oh, I hope she doesn't mind me saying this on the interview. She might.
A benefactor.
What's that?
You could just say a benefactor.
A benefactor. It's a little late now, but you know, a benefactor that I knew from Kokyo, and he had done Zen training and also lots of Tibetan training, and so I'd known her for years, ever since No Abode. So she was involved in No Abode, and I had lived in her garage here for a while because I actually inspired her to come up here, I think, or I had much to do with it anyway, because I found this Nepalese teacher of Buddhist dance up here that was doing classes, and that's very unusual. And she was into dance at the time. She kind of stopped her Zen priest training, was doing Indian dance, and I was like, this is just like Indian dance, but it's like Buddhist tantric deities. It's really cool. You'll love it. And so she came up to study with this Nepalese guy, and she's lived in the Portland area ever since. And so I once lived in her garage for a while, and I think that's the only time I lived with her before. But eventually, she bought this house as a practice place for my Sangha. So I've been leading this kind of Sangha on Sundays, the Sunday group, for many years now. And occasionally we had places. Once some people practicing with me had some spare money, and so they started renting a house. That was our first practice house. That was about 15 years ago. And I started leading some sessions then, and we had a bunch of people. We had like 7 people packed in this 2-bedroom house, I think. But it didn't last long. The landlord wanted to sell it, and then we kind of wandered again. And then me and this one other woman that was practicing with me found a free house we can stay in. We knew the landlords, and we did some session there. And they're pretty hardcore, like barefoot kinhin in the yard in the winter. I remember. So not a lot of people joined us, but so things like that had happened, and then, but the Sunday kept going. The Sunday group all through that time. So there have been people that practice with me off and on. Interesting, there's one guy that once invited me to lead a session out in Beaverton where he was living, and we did one there. And he's since gone on to make a fortune in Bitcoin. I mean, he didn't have much money then, but he was really into Bitcoin at the beginning. And then he got out before it went down, So he just recently emailed me and told me he bought all these acres out in Washington, and it'd be a good place to do a retreat, so I should come out there. And so we just did a bike ride out there in my household and checked it out. Not so good for getting there by bike. It's really steep and 80 miles away, but it was cool to check out. So things like that kept going. And now with this house, it's been a little more stable. But once we got this house, COVID happened. And so, and the woman that was already living here, who's an old-time friend of mine, turned out didn't really want to do a schedule. And so that it had a very slow start. It was really difficult. It was mostly me. And a little lonely, I have to say, and my mind was not in the best state during COVID, but eventually, and I also don't know how to promote anything, but eventually some people started coming here. And so now, I had stopped chanting, and, I was basically just sitting and doing the Qigong and Tai Chi practice I do, and the Raga Indian practice I do, which I all learned here in Portland since I've been living here. But then they came and they wanted to do chanting and all these things. So now we're suddenly.
You mean like Buddha Sutra chanting?
Yeah. So we do the Heart Sutra in Sanskrit now. I thought that would be fun. And we're starting to do the Daihi Shindarani, what's called that in Sanskrit. And we might start doing it in Korean now too, I think, because they have a really nice way of doing it. So you guys do Zen. It's like a Zen style meditation. You have 3 bells to start, 2 bells then, Kinyin, all that kind of stuff. So I don't call it Zen. If no one asks, they won't know what it is. But if they pull it out of me, they'll hear about it.
Yeah. And then
different kinds of Kinhin though. We have some slow walking. We've done 1-day sittings here, and we walk around the house slowly. But during the middle of the day, we do kind of normal pace walking out to the park, and then we do some sittings there. So we mix it up. And there's Qigong, that's part of it. So it's a little mixed up.
What style of Qigong do you do?
I do flying crane, which is one of these modern syncretic forms that combine a lot of things. So I find it to be a really good, like, all-body kind of workout.
Cool.
And I'm mostly trained in Tai Chi, though.
What's that?
Most of my training is in Tai Chi. So that's when I had a personal teacher that worked with me. So that's how I learned kind of body movement stuff. The Qigong I just kind of picked up along the way, but Qigong is just much easier and quicker to do for people instead of learning Tai Chi. So it works in a retreat setting better. So
what do you think why do you include Qigong into your practice? Like, what do you think it gives you?
I think people can just get stagnant at sitting. You know, it takes a while to learn to sit in a really vibrant way, to really understand this is an asana I'm holding, and really be awake and clear and vibrant.
Mm-hmm.
So mixing it with moving practices, I think, is really, really important. Um, Rinzai people are pretty big on that, and also the Soto, at least Tangen Roshi in the Soto Rinzai lineage was also really big on it, and I'm big on it. I've always been, interested in physical culture. It's just easier to get rid of your thinking when you're really
Mm-hmm.
moving and doing something intensely physical.
Yeah.
So to get a taste of that, and to get a taste of what it is to be really vibrant and alive and awake, if you're doing exercise, it helps. And now we have a lot of science about how important exercise is for depression and all
Mm-hmm.
kinds of mental blocks. And so
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I found it very helpful, and I have my own mental difficulties like everyone, and I find it really, really helpful. So
Mm-hmm.
in the Quantum school too, they do 108 prostrations every morning.
Yeah, I've
So
heard
I did
that.
that
It's
when I
crazy. Yeah.
yeah, and so I was running recently, which I used to do when I was a kid, and then I stopped for most of the time, and then recently I tried to do it again, but I got this Achilles tendon injury, so I had to stop, and so I started doing the 108 prostrations, which I really like.
Mm-hmm.
My tendon's still hurting with that, so now I stopped that. We'll see what comes next. But
Yeah.
I like all those things. I think they're really helpful for people,
Mm-hmm.
just to go back and forth between sitting and energetic moving. Really, you understand the sitting to be more energetic, and you understand the moving to have a peaceful center more.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it really helps people. If you're really trying to teach people, just be alive in the present, let everything go. Then
Mm-hmm.
if you just do sitting, it's hard because you can totally think a lot in sitting. And it's easier to get a taste of that in physical stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but sitting, you get to see what it's like to have all that thinking and how to let go of it, more clearly in kind of a more
Mm-hmm.
centered, calm way. So they both contribute a lot. So I like to mix them up.
So, does your little informal community, does it have a name?
Yeah, touching Earth Sangha.
Touching our song. Okay. If someone wanted to, if someone was intrigued by this and they wanted to get in touch and practice with you, what's the recommended way to do that?
Yeah, email. Yeah, I don't use a phone, so email is the way to go.
Mhm.
Um, and the Sangha email is touchingearth@riseup.net.
Okay.
And we have a website that until recently I thought was quite nice, even though I'm not a computer guy and I had to get some
Mhm.
people to try to help me. And we were using a free site and everything, but I thought it was quite nice. But then someone forgot to renew it, and so the text is still there, but this just happened like last week. All the pictures are gone, which were really nice, pictures of the mountain and
Oh.
stuff, and the trips, and the format is all awkward now. So we're hopefully going to get that back up and running. But the text is there in case you want to read that, and that's touching earth dot cloudaccess.host.
Okay. If you want,
And
you
that
can.
has
If you text me all these, I'll put them
okay,
in the description for the video.
okay,
Okay.
cool.
Cool.
Yeah,
All right. Well, thank you so
we'll get
much.
that
I
web.
really appreciate the time.
Yeah, is that it?
Yep. All right. I think we've gone about 2 hours now.
Oh, wow. I didn't
Yeah.
notice. Oh,
Yeah.
yes, it's funny. I
Yeah.
hope that was your intention, just to get the life story.
Yeah. I don't really have much attention. I mean, there's a little bit of a template, but I just kind of let it go where it's going to go.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what my Sangha is probably most known for is how we incorporate practice into a really radical, simple living.
Hmm.
So we try to get beyond car use and beyond plane use and beyond money use. I touched on the money use thing a little bit.
Right.
And we try to
Vegan,
really
right?
Yeah, and we try to really look at how to live in the wider society, really inspired, what our practice teaches us about that. Because I see what seems to me in more common sanghas, or trap that can be falling into, is you keep the spiritual practice, the sitting and the forms, but you don't really question the larger way you're living, your job, and the
Hmm.
other things you're doing in your life. And we're living in a culture right now that's killing itself. I think that's becoming clear. It's destroying the whole planet.
Hmm.
And so, to me, spiritual practice is teaching us the simplicity of spiritual practice, the simplicity of finding our deepest satisfaction just on being alive in this moment means so much of the other things our culture tells us we don't need. And if we take that really seriously, we can drop so many things that cause harm. And
Hmm.
so that's kind of our angle. So the essays and stuff on the website that are linked to the website are mostly about that.
Okay. Cool. And is all food vegan there, I imagine?
Yeah, we don't eat animal products. I'm trying to move away from the word vegan because that fits into people's boxes now about a certain kind of person and a certain kind of thing. We just try to look at could this be causing animal suffering to other beings? And if it does, let's not do it unless we really need to. If we don't need to, if we can be healthy without it, let's try to cut it out. So that's our
Awesome.
just like everything else in life. Do we really need to take that car trip or that plane trip? Do we really need to buy that new computer? I mean, I'm using computers, of course, but so there's, of course, compromises we have to make, and we're all in different places in life. But I think it's a central part of practice to be asking ourselves that question: what step can I take towards simplicity?
So you don't shave your head. I mean, do you still wear your robes, or like what? How much of like formal monk life?
I did wear robes for years, even living in Portland. For years after living in any formal place, because I did see there's this advantage of. Basically, it makes people ask you questions and ask you about practice, and then you get to talk about it. But eventually, those robes all fell apart, and I sewed them and repaired them, but it got threadbare, and it would be too much work. And those cost a lot of money, those monks' robes. So I was like, well, the Buddha's teaching was find scraps of cloth on the road and make your clothes from that. So I took that seriously. And in Portland, you don't have to get scraps of clothes. There's clothes in free boxes all over town because it's a tradition here to put stuff in free boxes. So I started getting all my clothes from free boxes. And so I feel like I'm wearing the okesa by wearing found clothes, but I don't bother, this is a nice silk shirt. It's all from free boxes. So I feel like I'm following the spirit of it, but I don't wear formal robes. And I lose the looking distinctive part and people asking me about it. But that's where I'm at the moment. Who knows what tomorrow will bring.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for the time.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Okay, I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah.